Well, welcome back, folks. I hope you had a good meal. I hope it wasn't too much. I don't want to see anybody going to sleep on me. That would be embarrassing for you and for me. We want to begin with a word of prayer, so I invite you to bow your heads with me. Father in heaven, as we begin this session this afternoon, we ask for the presence of your Spirit. Teach us what we need to learn to enhance our personal walk with our beloved Jesus. Thank you for the promise of your presence. We claim that promise in the precious name of your blessed Son, Jesus. Amen. Amen. We're going to begin our session on page 143. Page 143. This is the parable of the householder, the tenants, and the son. And we'll follow through the lesson just as we've done before. In this lesson, we are going to study the parable that is found in Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. This tragic story begins with a description of the bountiful blessings which God poured out upon the nation of Israel. It ends, however, with the rejection of that people and the adoption of the Gentiles as God's chosen nation. Was this parable meant for the Jews only? Or is there the possibility that we could repeat the sad history today? Now it says here, because of the lesson's length, it will take 2 sessions to study it. We are actually going to try and study it in just this one session. So we're going to go very, very quickly. But let's look first of all at the textual background, the historical background, and the meaning of the symbols in the parable. First of all, the textual setting of this parable, when it was told, in what context. Number one, what great event took place the day before Jesus told this parable? The answer is, it was the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And that took place on Sunday, which is known among Christians as Palm Sunday. So we know when Jesus told this parable. He told it the day after, when he entered Jerusalem. Now, where and to whom did Jesus address this parable? Well, under number 2, we have the answer. It says in Matthew 21 and verse 23, "And when he," that is Jesus, "was come into the temple," so we know that this parable was told in the temple, "the chief priests and the elders," now we know to whom he was addressing this parable. It wasn't generally to all of the Israelites. It was to the priests and the elders of the people that came unto him. So we know when. It was the day after the triumphal entry. We know where. It was in the temple. And we know to whom. The priests and the elders of Israel. In other words, the leadership of the nation. Number 3, whose temple did Jesus enter before narrating this parable? In other words, what is the temple called when Jesus went into the temple at the end of his triumphal entry on Palm Sunday? The answer is in Matthew 21, verses 12 and 13. It says, "And Jesus went into the temple of God." Notice what the temple is called at this point. It's called the temple of God. And then Jesus casts out the money changers, and notice what he says. "And he said unto them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." So when Jesus enters, it's called the temple of God, and he refers to that temple as what? As my house. So it was still the house of Jesus when he entered the temple. We're going to see later on that there's a change. It no longer says, my house, my temple, but it is your house is left unto you desolate. Now let's take a look at the symbols of the parable. Now it says here, warning, do not look at the note below this question before you fill in the blanks. Well, that applies only if you were filling out this lesson beforehand. So let's interpret the meaning of the symbols. The householder in the parable is God. The husbandmen are Israel's leaders, those to whom Jesus was speaking. The act of leasing the vineyard represents God's call to Israel at Mount Sinai, inviting them to be his people and to share the gospel. In other words, that's where God officially begins to lease his vineyard to the Jewish nation. The vineyard is Israel. And we're going to notice that there's a second application, but we're looking at the first application now. The tower is the temple. The hedge is the law. The servants that God sends are the prophets. The Son, of course, is Jesus Christ. The fruit that is expected of the husbandman represents the fruit of the Spirit, which is mentioned in Galatians chapter 5. And then the other husbandmen to whom the vineyard is given, when the first ones that the vineyard was leased to rejected it, represents the Gentiles. So basically that is the meaning. You'll notice the note that we find here at the bottom of this. There's a scholar by the name of Joachim Jeremias. He did intensive study on the parables of Christ. Not everything he says is kosher. He's a historical critical scholar. He's liberal. But he's right when he says this. The vineyard is clearly Israel. The tenants are Israel's rulers and leaders. The owner of the vineyard is God. The messengers are the prophets. The Son is Christ. The punishment of the husbandman symbolizes the ruin of Israel. The other people are the Gentile church. So very correct interpretation. Now the parable has 6 historical stages, or 6 historical periods, if you please. Number 1 has stage number 1. It says, "And when the time of the fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the husbandmen that they might receive the fruits of it." That's the first stage. Sends messengers expecting the husbandmen to give the owner the fruits that he should receive. We're just going to look at the 6 stages, and then we're going to look at them more closely. The second historical stage is after, in the first stage, the ones who are to care for the vineyard don't give him any fruit to the owner. So he's going to send other messengers. It says here in Matthew 21:36, "Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did likewise unto them." So they reject a second invitation. Number 3, stage number 3 is question number 3. What important event took place at the third historical stage? The parable says, "But last of all, he sent unto them his Son." Who would that be? Jesus. Saying, "They will reverence my Son." But of course they didn't. They cast him out of the vineyard and they killed him. Stage number 4, on the very next page, is the reaction of the owner of the vineyard when they reject the first 2 calls. It says, "God will miserably destroy those wicked men who destroyed the Son." So, in other words, the 4th stage is that those who rejected the second call were going to be punished with destruction. That's Matthew 21 and verse 41. In the 5th stage, we find that the vineyard is now leased to other individuals. You see, the first nation, the Jewish nation, the theocracy, did not return the fruits when they should. And so now other individuals or another nation is called to do what the first ones that were invited did not do. So under the 5th stage, and by the way, these are the very individuals to whom Jesus is talking that are giving this answer. He will let out, that means to lease, his vineyard unto other husbandmen, which shall render unto him the fruits in their seasons. And that means that the Gentiles were now going to fulfill the purpose for the call of Israel. They were going to go out and they were going to share the message that Israel should have shared and did not. And then we have stage number 6. The 6th and final stage is really actually discussing the destruction of Jerusalem, but it has a broader application than that because immediately you're going to see the connection with the prophecy of Daniel 2. Notice what it says there in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 44. And whosoever shall fall on this stone, who is the stone? Jesus. Whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken. In other words, if you fall on Jesus, your selfishness will be broken, you'll be converted. But on whomsoever it shall fall, what is going to happen? It will grind him to powder. Does there seem to be any connection with Daniel chapter 2? When the stone hits the feet of the image, it demolishes everything and the wind carries everything away. Well, that has an individual application, and it also has a broader worldwide application, as we're going to notice at the end of our lesson. So are the 6 stages clear? The first stage, messengers are sent out. The vineyard is leased. Messengers are sent out to get the fruits. No fruit. Another group of messengers are sent out. They don't give the fruits either. Finally, the owner of the vineyard sends his son. They say, he's the heir, let's kill him. They throw him out of the vineyard. Then into the 4th stage, the sentence is pronounced that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The 5th stage is that the vineyard is now leased out to a nation that will produce the fruits thereof, which is the Gentiles. And then stage number 6 is the destruction of Jerusalem. Now let's go to number 7. To which great prophecy does the previous question allude? That is the one about grinding to powder those who do not fall upon the rock. Let's read the note. This parable vividly describes 6 stages of Israel's history, and I've already mentioned those. But let's go to number 6 under the footnote. Under the last stage, the stone which the builders rejected will pulverize those who rejected him. I believe that in the first instance, that refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, but it's much broader, as we're going to see. Keep in mind, for the time being, that this will take place on occasion of the great post-millennial judgment that is described in Revelation 20, 11 to 15. That's the fullest fulfillment. The partial fulfillment is the destruction of Jerusalem, because there was not one stone left upon another, according to what Jesus said. But in a broader sense, this has a cosmic meaning, like many other parables. It refers to an event that is going to take place after the millennium, the post-millennial judgment. Just keep that in the corner of your mind for now. Now, let's notice the first application of this parable. The first application is to literal Israel. Now, let's go to number 1. This is page 145. To which Old Testament prophecy did Jesus allude when he told the parable of the vineyard? Well, the answer is Isaiah chapter 5. You read Isaiah 5, and it has many of the same details that Jesus gave in his parable. So if we want to fully understand this parable, we need to understand Isaiah 5, which is the foundation and the resource material that Jesus used to explain this parable. Number 2, who was the leader of Israel in the wilderness? In other words, who leased this vineyard out to the Jewish theocracy? Well, Ellen White has the answer. Christ. And by the way, not only Ellen White, but also the Bible. It speaks about, the I am being in the burning bush. And Jesus later on says, before Abraham was I am. So we have several texts that indicate that the leader was Jesus. He was the one in the pillar of cloud, according to Exodus 23. So Christ was the leader of the children of Israel in their wilderness wanderings, enshrouded in the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. He led and guided them. Did God pour out abundant blessings upon Israel? That's our next point. Number 3. What blessings did God pour out upon Israel when he took them out of Egypt? Ellen White describes, he preserved them from the perils of the wilderness. Imagine living in the wilderness for 40 years. Not being able to plant and to harvest. No source of water. You know, the Bible even says that their shoes did not wear out for 40 years. Wouldn't you like to have a pair of shoes like that? No, it'd be kind of boring, right? But if you were in the wilderness, you would appreciate it. So it says he preserved them from the perils of the wilderness. He brought them into the land of promise. And in the sight of all the nations that acknowledge not God, he established Israel as his own chosen possession, the Lord's vineyard. So who is the vineyard? The vineyard is Israel. And you can go to Isaiah chapter 5, and it makes it very clear. Incidentally, if you notice on the next page, the Greek word to let out or to lease is the Greek word exedoto, where we get our word Exodus from. That's where we get the idea that God leased his vineyard to Israel at the Exodus. Exodus 19, 5 and 6, God says, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my special people. That's when God officially formed the covenant with Israel. And of course they said, we do. All that the Lord has said, we will do. But they didn't. They broke the covenant. They did not fulfill their commitment of preaching the gospel to the world. Now, what do the hedge and the tower represent? Once again, in Christ's Object Lessons, we find they were hedged about by the precepts of his law, the everlasting principles of truth, justice, and purity. And as the tower in the vineyard, God placed in the midst of the land his holy temple. So he hedged them about by the law, their protection, and he gave them the temple, that majestic building that was to attract all of the nations to the Messiah. Number 5, what was God's glorious plan for the children of Israel? You know, God chose the Jewish nation for only one reason, and that was to prepare the world for the Messiah. That was the lone reason why God chose Israel, to preserve the truth and proclaim the truth about the coming of the Messiah, so that when Messiah would come, everybody would be ready to receive him. Did they fail or did they succeed in their mission? They failed. So if they failed in the reason for their existence, would God have to find another method for the message to go to the world? Absolutely. Because there are people that are saying today that, God still has a special plan with the Jews after the rapture of the church. Well, the fact is that they did not fulfill their commitment in the past, and they're not going to do it in the future either. I'm talking not about individual Jews. God loves each individual Jew in the world. I'm talking about the Jewish theocracy, the nation that God chose as a people, as a church, to proclaim the message to the world. So what was God's plan for Israel? God desired to make his people Israel a praise and a glory. The glory of God, his majesty and power, were to be revealed in all their prosperity. God furnished them with every facility for becoming the greatest nation on earth. You know, the Queen of Sheba provides a good example. She comes, and Solomon shows her all of the majestic things that God has done for Israel. She says, how is this? What is this? And at that time, Solomon, of course, was on a good page with the Lord. He says, it's because we serve the true God. We serve the Lord. And so the Queen of Sheba goes back to her line. She says, man, they have the right God. They're prospering because of him. And in the book of Zechariah, it says that many from all nations would come and grab onto the robe of a Jew, saying, we'll go with you because we know that God is with you. That was God's plan. It failed, not because of God. Number 6, did God's plan embrace Israel alone, or did it include all the nations of the world? All the nations, folks. God told Abraham, in thee and in thy seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through the seed. The plan was to embrace the whole world. Ellen White wrote, through the Jewish nation, it was God's purpose to impart rich blessings to all peoples. Through Israel, the way was to be prepared for the diffusion of his light to the whole world. Wasn't that an awesome plan? Wow. And of course, there are Bible passages that tell us why God chose Israel. You can read those. Deuteronomy 7, verses 6, 9, and 11 through 15. Ellen White uses these passages. Deuteronomy 7, verse 6, verse 9, and verses 11 to 15. And Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. Those verses clearly explain God's plan for Israel. Actually, it was God's plan through Israel to save save the whole world, to embrace the whole world. How does Ellen White describe God's awesome plan for the salvation of the world? Christ's Object Lessons, Ellen White wrote, "But it was God's purpose that by the revelation of his character through Israel, men should be drawn unto him. To all the world, the gospel invitation was to be given. Through the teaching, now notice, through the teaching of the sacrificial service, Christ was to be uplifted before the nations." In other words, they were supposed to explain the reason for all of the ceremonial system that they had. They were to explain all the Hebrew feasts. You know, why you have a Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits, and then 50 days later, Pentecost, and then a long summer drought. And then the summer drought is broken by the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. You know, all of that was messianic. They were responsible to share the sanctuary service and the calendar of the sanctuary service, which is the Hebrew feast, so that the entire world would be ready to receive the Messiah. And yet we find that when Jesus came, he came to his own, and his own received him not. They failed in their mission. Number 9, what were the nations supposed to do as they understood the gospel plan? Oh, what a plan it was. All were to unite themselves with his chosen people. As the numbers of Israel increased, they were to enlarge their borders. In other words, it wasn't only Canaan, folks. It was the world. Abraham was promised, according to Romans 4:13, he was promised that he would be heir of the world. Of course, that will be fulfilled eventually with God's people, because the meek will inherit the earth. But God planned that for Israel. So, as the numbers of Israel increased, they were to enlarge their borders until their kingdom should embrace the world. Wow, what a plan. Number 10, why did Israel fail to fulfill God's plan? The blessings they had received brought no blessing to the world. All their advantages were appropriated for their own glorification. They came to brag about the temple and about how our crops produce more and what a great infrastructure we have. They bragged about all of the blessings, but they didn't realize that all of that was functional to fulfill a mission. So the question is, what did Israel do with the vineyard and with the fruit? That's number 11. The husbandmen who had been placed in charge of the Lord's vineyard were untrue to their trust. The priests and teachers were not faithful instructors of the people. They desired to appropriate the fruits of the vineyard. In other words, they appropriated the fruits for themselves. It was their study to attract attention and homage to themselves. Number 12. What did the rabbis do to lead the people astray? What they did was establish traditions that are not contained in Scripture. They taught a whole mess of traditions and ceremonies and practices that God did not establish. For example, Korban. You know, children could say, our possessions are Korban. That means dedicated to the temple, so we can't give our parents any of that because it belongs to the temple. So they could deprive their parents of being taken care of by their children in the name of serving God and dedicating everything they had to the temple. And Jesus said, you transgress the commandment of God by your tradition, but because Korban contradicted the commandment that says, honor your father and your mother. Notice what it says here. The people lived in continual unrest, for they could not fulfill the requirements laid down by the rabbis. In other words, the requirements were so stringent and so many that there was no way that people could even keep them. As they saw the impossibility of keeping man-made commandments, they became careless in regard to the commandments of God. Now, did God warn Israel that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing? Yeah, this is where you have the first messengers. What did God try to do to bring Israel back to his original plan? Ellen White wrote, prophets and messengers were sent to urge God's claim upon the husbandmen. But instead of being welcomed, they were treated as enemies. The husbandmen persecuted and killed them. That is literally true. And by the way, Ellen White is not inventing anything. In the next question, We have a passage from 2 Chronicles 36, 15, and 16, where this is before the captivity, before Israel was taken to Babylon. It says, "And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy." So he sends them captive to Babylon. So after the captivity, God restores them to their land. And he gives them the prophecy of the 70 weeks. That's not one of the lessons, but in the Daniel series, I deal with that. God says, okay, I'm going to give you 70 weeks of grace for your people and for your holy city, God says to Daniel. So when Israel was restored to their land after the Babylonian captivity, who helped them in the work of restoration? Well, Ezra 5 verse 2 says, "And with them were the prophets of God helping them." Now, let's read the note. In this parable, Jesus recalled that God sent a second group of messengers to gather fruit from the vineyard. Jesus knew Hebrew history. After the Babylonian captivity, God did raise up a plethora of prophets and messengers. Some of these were Haggai, Zechariah, Joshua the high priest, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Though the people started out well under these consecrated leaders, that is, faithful husbandmen, the book of Malachi reveals that their successors, those are the unfaithful husbandmen, led the people into apostasy once more. So that when Jesus came, Israel was in apostasy once again. So what does God do as a last resort? To try and reach his people and tell them, let's get down to business. Let's do what you're supposed to do as my chosen people. Number 16. But last of all, does that have a certain finality to it? Last of all? But last of all, he sent unto them his Son, saying, they will reverence my Son. By the way, those who are listening still haven't caught on who Jesus is talking about, even though they knew the parable of the vineyard that we find in Isaiah chapter 5. Now, the Gospel of Mark says that the householder sent a beloved son. That's significant, isn't it? Jesus actually said that God sent a beloved son, which is the very title applied to Jesus in Mark 1, verses 9 through 11, when he was baptized. The expression last of all indicates finality. The Son will make the last call for the Jewish people to produce fruit. If they don't, they will be cut down and cast into the fire, as John the Baptist warned them even before Jesus began his ministry. What did they do with the Son? With the greatest revelation that God could ever have given. Well, it says there in Matthew 21, 38 and 39, but when the husbandmen saw the Son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and something is missing there, and seize his inheritance. And they caught him and cast him out of the vineyard. Jesus was actually died outside Jerusalem, and they slew him. Now, Joachim Jeremias has a very interesting comment on this parable. He wrote, the arrival of the Son allows them to assume that the owner is dead and that the Son has come to take up his inheritance. If they kill him, the vineyard becomes ownerless property, which they can claim as being first on the spot. So they said, the landowner, we don't know anything about him, but this is the Son, he's the heir. If we kill him, we can keep the inheritance ourselves. That's what they're saying. Let's continue the note here. In the light of Luke 20, verse 9, Jeremias' remarks appear accurate. There we are told that the householder went into a far country for a long time. See, it's important to read the parallel in the Gospel of Luke. This seems to indicate that the vine dressers believed the owner was an absentee landlord. In their minds, it was only the Son who stood between them and the inheritance. Ironically, if the Jews had accepted Jesus, they would have become joint heirs with him of the Father's promises in Romans 8, verse 17. But by rejecting him, they forfeited any right to the inheritance. The promises were made to Abraham and his seed. And only those who choose to unite with the seed, who is Jesus, will inherit the promises. Thus, the Jewish leaders caused that which they wished to prevent, and prevented that which they wished to cause. Jesus was killed after being cast out of Jerusalem. In this sense, he was cast out of the vineyard and killed. Are you with me? Powerful parable that Jesus told. Number 18. What did God do when the Jews chose Barabbas instead of Jesus and declared, "We have no king but Caesar"? Here Ellen White makes a very perceptive statement about something that is going to happen after the millennium. That's why this parable has something to do with events at the very end of time, even after the close of probation and the second coming. Notice what Ellen White wrote in Volume 9 of Manuscript Releases, page 7. There in his open hand, this is speaking on Revelation 5, there in his open hand lay the book, the roll of the history of God's providences, the prophetic history of nations and the church. Herein was contained the divine utterances, his authority, his commandments, his laws, the whole symbolic counsel of the eternal, and the history of all ruling powers in the nations. In other words, this scroll that is in the hand, the right hand of the one who is seated on the throne, contains the whole history of the world from beginning to end. God must have some kind of technology to save all of that. I don't know what kind of bytes it would be. They would have to invent a new word for the number of bytes. She continues, in symbolic language was contained in that roll the influence of every nation, tongue, people from the beginning of Earth's history to its close. And their decision was registered in that scroll. And someday they will have to face their decision again when God rolls the film. Because I think the technology is far greater than just writing things in books with ink. You know, he was using terminology that prophets of that day could understand, which they use books to write. Actually, it's a scroll, parchment. But I believe if God had called a prophet today, he would speak of computers and software and hardware, a terminology that people can understand today. And, you know, Ellen White says that after the millennium, God is going to show above the city the entire history of the world in panoramic view. What kind of technology do you need to record the history of the world from beginning to end without missing a beat? Human beings brag about their technology. They're just copying. They're copying the Lord's technology with the little intelligence that God has given them. But they don't give any credit to the Lord. Now, number 19. According to Matthew 21:41, who pronounced the doom of the Jewish nation? It wasn't Jesus. It was them. They say unto him, because he asked, what are they going to do? What will the owner of the vineyard do with those who did that with his son? Oh, they say unto him, he will miserably destroy those wicked men, and will let out his vineyard unto other husbandmen, which shall render him the fruits in their seasons. In other words, they're pronouncing their own doom. They're saying the vineyard is going to be given to somebody else to fulfill the mission that was not fulfilled by the first ones that the vineyard was given to. What did the Jews say when they spoke of their own doom? Now they realize that Jesus is talking about them. And so they say very shortly, God forbid. God forbid that such a thing happen, that the kingdom be given to someone else other than to us, to whom God gave his vineyard. Number 21. What happened to the Jewish nation for rejecting the Messiah? Ellen White remarked, and history proves, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was laid in ruins, and its site plowed like a field. It was ground to powder, so to speak. The privileges that they had abused, The work they had slighted was entrusted to others. And then Jesus, after telling this parable, among others, he leaves the temple. When he went in, it was the temple of God, and he called it my house. But the last time he leaves the temple, he changes his tune. In Matthew 23, 38 and 39, it says, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." When is that going to take place? Well, they will say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." You read a great controversy on the destruction of Jerusalem. Ellen White says that it's when, after the millennium, the holy city descends and Jesus is coming with his saints, they will say, not because they love Jesus, they will say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." They will be forced, by the force of truth, to say that. Now, what about us today? Does this parable have anything to say to us who live today? Or is this only about the Jewish nation? Well, let's pursue this. Does this parable apply alone to the Jewish nation? Notice what Ellen White had to say about this. The parable of the vineyard applies not alone to the Jewish nation. It has a lesson for us. The church in this generation has been endowed by God with great privileges and blessings. Would you say that's true? Just look at the blessings that God has given the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Its message, its infrastructure, its organization is the marvel of the world. But now notice it says, and he expects corresponding what? Corresponding returns. So God doesn't only give all these blessings and say, this is for you, do whatever you want with it. No, God says there are strings attached to the blessings that God gives. Number two, on how broad a stage does God expect his people to reveal right principles to the world? The answer is, these principles are to be manifest in the individual Christian, that's person, in the family, that is the broader circle, in the church, even broader, and in every institution established for God's service. Is it just possible that we might have to say someday, God forbid? Makes you wonder. Number three, what dangers does the church of today face? Ellen White responds, it is when character building is neglected, when the adornment of the soul is lacking, when the simplicity of godliness is lost sight of, that pride and love of display demand magnificent church edifices, splendid adornings, and imposing ceremonies. So when there's a lack of internal piety, to cover up the lack of internal piety, you have all of these outward trimmings that attract the eye and attract the ear, and people say, wow, God is definitely there. But it mocks the sin-sick soul, as Ellen White expressed it. Number four, what is Jesus hungering for in his church today? Is Jesus hungry for the fruit of the vineyard? Does he have a right to expect returns? You better believe he does. Who gave all of the blessings so that the vineyard could sprout and the vineyard could grow and the vineyard could produce fruit? He was the one who gave all those benefits. So does he have a right to expect harvest if he invested everything? Of course. Let's read this. Christ hungers to receive from his vineyard the fruit of holiness. Now we're seeing what the fruit is. Holiness and unselfishness. He looks for the principles of love and goodness. Are those fruits of the Spirit? Yeah. For the fruit that is mentioned in Galatians chapter 5. She continues, he looks for the principles of love and goodness. Not all the beauty of art can bear comparison with the beauty of temper and character to be revealed in those who are Christ's representatives. Why does God impart His gifts to us. God imparts His gifts to us that we may also what? Give. And thus make known His character to the world. So why does God give us our talents? Why does He give us health? Why does He give us intelligence? Why does He give us financial resources? It's not for us to enjoy a happy and fruitful life. The purpose is to use these assets to reach other people. They are given to us for service. And if we're not doing that, we are eating the fruit, but we are not giving fruit to the one who invested all. Number 6, does God ever require of us that which it is impossible to perform? Some people say, well, God's requirements is far beyond my capacity to fulfill. Well, you know the statement of Ellen White, all His biddings are enablings. God never asks us to do something that He does not give us the power to do. In fact, notice what this statement says. God makes no requirement without making provision for its fulfillment. Through the grace of Christ, we may accomplish everything that God requires. So everything that God requires, we can fulfill according to His grace. Number 7, to which church is the Laodicean message especially applicable? Well, I mentioned this morning, it's those Jehovah's Witnesses across town, right? The Mormons. They are the ones that are not fulfilling the promise of going out and giving fruit in its season. Well, I see Jehovah's Witnesses in my neighborhood knocking on doors all the time. They put Adventists to shame. And the Mormon missionaries too. Notice the statement. Shall Seventh-day Adventists walk in the same path as did the Jewish nation? Shall the message to the Laodicean church be applicable to this people? She's talking about the Seventh-day Adventist church. Shall those who have seen great light, who have had large opportunities and many privileges, cease to do service as witnesses for Christ? Number 8, is the Seventh-day Adventist church today, number 8, is the Seventh-day Adventist church today in danger of following the same path as ancient Israel? What does Laodicea say? I am rich and increased with goods, and I have need of nothing. Was that the attitude of the Jewish nation? I got it all. And they used it for themselves. There's the very same danger. And Laodicea is the end-time church, folks. This parable speaks to us. And by the way, let me tell you something. No church or institution is unconditionally chosen by God. Not even the Seventh-day Adventist church. And people don't like me to say that. They say, oh, Pastor Bohr, you're saying that God is going to reject the Adventist church. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that no church is unconditionally chosen, that it's going to go through to the end. Amen. It must meet the responsibilities that God has given it. It must use the privileges and opportunities that God has given to share with the world. Let me read you an interesting statement from Ellen White. This is one that is not read real frequently. She wrote, in the balances of the sanctuary, the Seventh-day Adventist church is to be weighed. She will be judged by the privileges and advantages that she has had. If her spiritual experience does not correspond to the advantages that Christ, at infinite cost, has bestowed on her, if the blessings conferred have not qualified her to do the work entrusted to her, on her will be pronounced the sentence, found wanting. By the light bestowed, the opportunities given, will she be judged. That's pretty explicit. So we must make sure, folks, that our church uses all of the opportunities and blessings that we have received to bless others, to bring others to Christ, and to uphold the truth as it is in Jesus. Now, let's go to number 9. What does Jesus say He will do to the church today if it fails to repent, the end-time church? So then, because you are lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot. See, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Another expression, spewing out of the mouth is called the shaking. So is Laodicea guaranteed it's going to go through absolutely, completely, no doubt whatsoever about it? No. It says, you're not hot or cold. I wish that you were hot or cold. And if you don't warm up, I'll spew you out of my mouth. It's a solemn warning, folks. The Israelites in Christ, they said, we've been chosen, unconditionally chosen, and there's no way that we could ever fail. We know what happened. Ellen White says that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is repeating the history of Israel. And I would say, God forbid. But we, as members, need to make sure that it doesn't happen with God's remnant church. Number 10. Is Jesus anxious to eat the fruit of the vineyard? Of course he is. Notice the message to the Laodicean church. At what time does Jesus come to the Laodicean church? At supper time. He wants grapes, not sour grapes. He wants to eat. It says, so then, because, number 10, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will what? Sup with him, and he with me. Where is Christ with regard to the Laodicean church? Is he in the Laodicean church or outside? I'm not saying it. The Bible is saying it. And this is the last church. By the way, this is the reason why Secrets Unsealed exists. We love this church. This is God's remnant church. And the devil knows it. So he's doing everything to distract the remnant church from what it really should be doing, sharing present truth with the world so that Jesus can come. We do not exist for the same reason that evangelicals and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists exist. We have a special mission for this special time. Present truth. And if we're not sharing it, we have no reason to exist. It's that simple. Thought question. Has God given the Seventh-day Adventist Church great prophetic light in the areas of education, medical work, publishing, family life, lifestyle, health, etc.? Has the church today generally obeyed that light in all those institutions? Sadly, no. Now let's go to the broadest application of this parable. It deals with the world. Does this parable apply only to Israel and the church? We've noticed that it applies to literal Israel. It applies to the end-time church, the church that will be here till the very end. By the way, Laodicea, and I don't have time to get into this, but Laodicea will eventually morph into the Philadelphian church. It's amazing how many times Ellen White talks about the 144,000 in the context of the Philadelphian church, which is the church of brotherly love. The faithful in the Laodicean church will be Philadelphians. Now, I don't have time to get into that, but just read the first vision that Ellen White had in early writings, and you'll be able to see it clearly. So, number 1, God claims the whole earth as his vineyard. So you notice first Israel's the vineyard, then the church now that takes the place of Israel is the vineyard, but it has a broader meaning. The whole world is God's vineyard. Number 2, what is the great sin of the world today? Now we're not talking about the remnant church, we're talking about the world in general. Ingratitude to God, the neglect of opportunities and blessings, the selfish appropriation of God's gifts. These were comprised in the sin that brought wrath upon Israel. They are bringing ruin upon the world today. Has God poured out, for example, this country, the United States, has God poured out abundant blessings upon the United States of America? Ellen White says that this nation is a favored people. Prosperous. Huge territory. 300 million people. Beautiful scenes of nature. I mean, it has everything. That's why everybody wants to come here. Freedom. Also, what has the United States done with the privileges that God has given her? Ellen White says that it's slighted those privileges and it has forgotten God. So is the same thing going to happen that happened with Israel and will happen with the church if it doesn't meet the responsibilities that God has given it? Absolutely. Number 3, In what condition are God's people found as the world rushes to its ruins? Men are in peril. Multitudes are perishing. But how few of the professed followers of Christ are burdened for these souls? There is a stupor, a paralysis upon the people of God, which prevents them from understanding the duty of the hour. The church is paralyzed. You can tell that by the attendance at Sabbath school. You can tell that by the number of people that are involved in the mission of reaching others for Christ. Ellen White describes it as a stupor and a paralysis that does not allow the church to fulfill its duty to the world, to the entire world. Number 4, what did Israel fail to do when they entered the land of Canaan? Well, you have to fill that space out. Ellen White says that they did not make a total conquest. They actually conquered part of the Holy Land, and they didn't conquer the rest. They said, well, it's all of this land flowing with milk and honey. We've got a lot of it, so let's just enjoy the fruits of the land. And they did not totally conquer the land. And Ellen White says that the church needs to conquer the whole world. Not only live comfortably because you conquered part of the world. Number 5, how is our very own local church repeating the same error as ancient Israel? Ellen White answers, with the whole world before them in need of the gospel, professed Christians congregate where they themselves can enjoy the gospel privileges. They do not feel the necessity of occupying new territory, carrying the message of salvation into regions beyond. And then she asks, are they less guilty than was the Jewish church? See, now she's speaking about the end times, about God's end time church. Question number 6. What awesome statement does Ellen White make about God's people today? The professed followers of Christ are on trial before the universe, heavenly universe. But the coldness of their zeal and the feebleness of their efforts in God's service mark them as unfaithful. She's talking about the church in her day and age. I wonder what she would say today if she resurrected. Number 7. What will happen with many professed followers of Jesus when their names come in review before the heavenly universe? Well, this is an awesome statement from Ellen White. Many there are against whose names will be found written in the books of heaven, not producers but consumers. By many who bear Christ's name, his glory is obscured, his beauty veiled. Do these parables have anything to say to us? They speak directly to us. They're not just ancient documents that were written to an ancient people. In principle, they apply to us as well today. Number 8. Who were particularly to blame for the apostasy of Israel? This is awesome. This is a very solemn statement. She states, for the rejection of Christ, with the results that followed, she's speaking about the leaders of Israel, the ministers and the theologians, they were responsible. A nation's ruin, actually a nation's sin, and a nation's ruin were due to the religious leaders. As the leaders go, so goes the church. And there's this tendency of the people to say, well, these are the guys that studied. They're the PhDs. They're the ones that know. By the way, I don't have anything against a PhD that is consecrated to the Lord and has done research and is able to teach Scripture with power. No problem. But the problem in the days of Christ was with the leadership. They had lost the vision, and as the leaders were, so were the people. Number 9, is the same error being committed today by the Christian church? Ellen White answers, from many of the pulpits of the churches, the people are taught, and this is not in Adventist churches as far as I know, that the law of God is not binding upon them. Human traditions, ordinances, and customs are exalted. Pride and self-satisfaction because of the gifts of God are fostered, while the claims of God are ignored. So God not only pours out blessings, He pours out blessings with a purpose, that those blessings be used for His honor and glory. You know, Jesus once said, "Give, and it will be given unto you." It is more blessed to give than to receive. So when we give, we receive more. When we don't give, we lose. So what Jesus is saying here in this parable is that as we receive the blessings of God, we share those blessings with others. And as a result, we receive more blessings. It's kind of one of the parables that we're going to study is the individual who filled his barns with produce. He says, wow, I need to have a bigger barn. And so, he builds a bigger barn so that he can store all, by the way, he says, my goods. And so he builds a bigger barn. That one becomes full. So it's, I have to have a bigger barn. And eventually he said, this night your soul will be demanded of you. And Ellen White, commenting on this parable, says what he should have done is he should have used everything in his barn and given it away. And then he would have room for the additional harvest that would come in. And the harvest would continue growing and growing and growing as he was giving. But because he hoarded, he not only lost his financial benefits, but he also lost his soul that very evening. The final question is, what can we learn from Israel's failure? Ellen White wrote, "The result of Israel's sin is before us." And then she ends with a question, like Jesus many times ended his parables with a question, and that is, will the church of today take the warning? The ball is in the court of the church. We are the ones that have to answer that question. And I would hope that the answer to that question is, yes, the church will take the warning. And the church will use the blessings and opportunities that God has given it to bless the world and to reach souls for Jesus Christ. Because one soul saved in the kingdom is worth more than an entire world and everything in it. It's an eternal investment that will never fail.